Hey everyone, welcome. We're starting to see some attendees pop in. I think we'll give it a couple of minutes before we get started, just to allow folks until like 1:02 Eastern time to pop in. But we're really excited for this storytelling webinar today. I think, we always say that storytelling is like the main key to grassroots fundraising, and we have some really great examples of that in practice today that we're going to be sharing with y'all. So should be a lot of fun. Again, we'll just wait a couple of minutes to get started while people kind of trickle in. I should say also, my name is Katie Laura. I'm with ioby, and it's nice to see and meet all of you. Little participant numbers popping in, so hi. All right, I think we'll give it just one more minute, and then we will go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with just a little quick intro to our webinar series and to ioby, and then we will hear from our three panelists. And after that, we'll have some time for some questions and questions from all of our participants as well. So just as you're listening, if things pop into your head that you want to ask, just go ahead and type them into that little Q&A thing on the bottom, and that will send them to us, and then we'll try to get through as many audience questions as we possibly can before the end of the hour. So great, well, why don't we get started now? Again, my name is Katie Laura. I'm with ioby, and welcome to the latest in our series of webinars where we learn from within our amazing network of project leaders who are making positive change in their communities. We're super excited today to talk about storytelling. I think that storytelling is the key to successful fundraising and gaining support for your project and building a network and everything. It all just really comes down to having a compelling story that you use to communicate your project. So this is a topic very near and dear to my heart and all of our hearts at ioby. So yeah, I'll just start by talking a little bit about ioby. Yeah. For folks who don't know about us, I know some folks who are on probably have had experience working with us or know about us, but we use crowdfunding as a tool to enable local leaders to plan, fund, and implement projects, and by doing that, to step into civic leadership. We believe that neighbors know best how to make positive change in their communities, and our platform, which is there on the left, our website, and our services represented here by our staff are designed to help people get the tools to make positive change in their own neighborhoods. And we've worked so far with almost 2,000 project leaders around the country. Together, they have raised an impressive nearly $6 million in small donations. The average donation is $35, but like $5, $10 donations are very, very regular from within their communities. And we really think, by doing this work, what's raised is more than just the money. It's the support and, practice being leaders, practice making positive change. And we really believe that grassroots fundraising is grassroots organizing. And we've seen this with, thousands of people who we've worked with. We work nationwide. Anyone, anywhere in the US can work with us. But we do have staff on the ground in these cities, and we're mission-driven to focus particularly on communities with a history of disinvestment, where often local leaders might not have access to traditional forms of capital, like foundation grants or government funding. So we just provide an alternative to, startup funding to get an idea off the ground. And we also work with many different types of groups. Established nonprofits, small unincorporated groups that might not have, any paid staff, just groups of neighbors, block coalitions, things like that, even small businesses, if their project is in the public good. And we also partner with government groups. So all that we ask in order to work with a project is that it takes place in your neighborhood or your community, and that it benefits the public. And one of the things that makes us different, I think, than a traditional crowdfunding platform is that a lot of our important work is offline. So we have this online platform, ioby.org. But everyone who works with us has access to a fundraising coach who can help plan their campaign, help them tell their story, which is what we're talking about today, build their donor list and things like that. And we provide resources in fundraising, but also around project implementation. And really one of the most important things we do is connect folks who are making change with each other. Because at the end of the day, we're not the experts in making positive change. You are, and the folks that we work with are. That's why we like to feature stories and learnings from within our network, like in this webinar. So we have a series of webinars once a month where we hear from different project leaders about their experience. So today we'll hear from 3 project leaders about what they've done, the positive change that they've made, and what role storytelling played. So I'm going to open it up to hear from our project leaders now, and then I'll come back after that with just a few storytelling best practices that we have learned over the years of doing this work. And then we'll open up a dialogue, and everyone will talk to each other, and we'll take some questions at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Alice to talk about the Unity in Our Community Time Bank.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or at least it's afternoon here. So Unity in Our Community Time Bank is a 10-year-old time banking organization here in the southwest neighborhood of Detroit. So the concept behind time banking is people exchanging services with each other using time instead of money as the unit of exchange. So for example, if I help somebody in their garden for 3 hours, they give me 3 hours through the time bank, and then I can use one of those hours to get my ripped pants mended, 2 of those hours to get somebody to come help me paint my porch. Really any service, anything that you can measure in time, you can exchange through the time bank. And so we really see this as a transformative idea for a couple of different reasons. First of all, it's rather than being based on like volunteerism charity model, it's really based on reciprocity. So the idea being that, that rather than divide people into givers and takers or volunteers and receivers, we're really with the idea that everybody has something to offer and everyone has needs. And we really have seen this over and over again with people who originally sign up, with the idea of being volunteers, but then have something in their life where they're like, oh yeah, like, could I use the time bank to help me out with this? It's also a great way to, we live in a community where there's a lot of activism, a lot of different groups that work off of unpaid time. And so it's a really nice way to fight burnout. I think we all know that there are instances where people don't feel appreciated when they're, not being paid. And so this is a really great way to say to the people who are contributing to another project that, hey, we really value your time. We can't pay you in dollars, but we can give you this time in the time bank that you can then use to get something that's really valuable to you. It also just builds community across different lines. We live in a really diverse neighborhood. We have a lot of immigrants, recent immigrants from Yemen and Central America, and just a really interesting mix of people and cultures. And so people who might not otherwise meet might meet because, somebody needs help shoveling their walk and during the winter, and you're there to help out with it. And to build this community, to build trust among people, to be able to exchange these services, we host a lot of social events, like you'll see on the screen right now, pumpkin carving and one of our cooking classes, which are really popular. And we also, organize group work days when someone has a big project that they need more than one person to help out with. Like you can see here, some work at a neighborhood community garden that was going on. And this all helps to build community. So with ioby, we were really fundraising for some general operating dollars. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics, but just, we like to be able to be really responsive to our community's needs, which means being able to buy, tools. We have a small tool bank that we're able to lend out to people, being able to buy supplies when people need them. Because the time bank really provides the people power for free, but oftentimes people need the supplies or equipment in order to make an exchange happen. And we also just like to be able to provide support with staff time or something like that to help people organize a project that they might not, that they have the idea for, and they can recruit the people through the time bank for, but they just need that little bit of extra logistics help to make it all happen. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Alice. And now let's hear from Aileen on the Arapahoe Street Protected Bike Lane. Hey, Aileen, you are on mute.
Unmute now. There we go. Now everyone can hear me. Hi, hopefully, right? Can you hear me? Good. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Aileen McCallum. I'm the Director of Civic Leadership Programs at the Downtown Denver Partnership. I have spent the last 13 years at the Downtown Denver Partnership. My role has evolved quite a lot over the last more than a decade. I've certainly worked on transportation and mobility projects, research. I'm currently within a membership team, and I work on events and leadership development right now in a city building context. But 5 years ago, I was working on building our protected bike lane network out in downtown Denver, working closely with the city on identifying where we wanted to host our protected bike lanes in downtown Denver. We already had, I think at that point, we had one protected bike lane in downtown along 15th Street, and we were identifying where we wanted to put our next protected bike lanes. We reached out to the city and had asked them, hey, we really want to invest in a study for building out protected bike lanes in downtown Denver. We're willing to crowdfund for it, raise money. And the city said, well, how about you help us actually build one? And that led to this crowdfunding conversation where we committed to raising the funds to completely design a new protected bike lane in downtown Denver. So that conversation happened in early 2014. I was very pregnant, and kind of set the stage for researching how we were actually going to get this done. And kind of before I left on maternity leave, I had found ioby through our research. And we then decided to move forward with ioby when I came back from maternity leave. And it was a really interesting couple of months. The Arapahoe Street Protected Bike Lane, we raised $35,000 for this on ioby, but in total we raised $156,000 with a foundation match and money from our business improvement district in downtown Denver. The Arapahoe Street corridor was selected through a public process, and it was really important to add to our protected bike lane network in downtown, because along with it's Couplet Street of Lawrence Street, it really provided a nice east-west connection through downtown Denver from a historically low-income neighborhood all the way through the heart of downtown Denver, near a park, Skyline Park in downtown, all the way to a college campus that hosts 3 academic institutions. So it was really important for us to be building these protected bike lane and safe connections through our downtown. I wanted to highlight that the addition of the protected bike lane along Arapahoe Street and then the commitment of the city to build out the protected bike lane on the Lawrence Street couplet, along with the investment of a protected bike lane on 14th Street a few years later, has really made a huge impact in how people bike to work or commute to work in downtown Denver. And the numbers that we have now, we do an annual commuter study, see how people get to work, but we've seen a 36% jump in the last 2 years of folks biking to work in downtown, from 6.6% to 9%. We had really been lagging in that 6% range for a number of years. And now that we have a lot of one-way streets in downtown Denver. So now that this two-way couplet has been introduced in downtown, we have really strong and safe northbound, southbound, eastbound, and westbound connection through downtown. And it really provides access through all of downtown Denver. Now that we have this really great protected bike lane network, it always needs to get improved. And I think one of the pictures that you've seen before was actually not of the project itself, but of the enhancements to the bike lane that the city is now committing to. We are still adding paint, we're adding more bollards, we're adding features all the time in downtown Denver to continue to enhance our bike lanes and the Arapahoe Street bike lane itself. And then now we have a total of 19.4 bike lanes and trails through downtown Denver, and a total of 4 protected bike lanes in downtown. And it's really, as I've told you with the numbers, it really has made a difference. So I'm looking forward to talking more about the details and hearing your questions, but those are the basics. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Aileen. And now let's kick it over to Michelle to hear about Design as Protest Day of Action.
Good afternoon, everyone. Like Katie said, my name is Michelle Crawford, and I was the Design as Protest Day of Action organizer for the city of Cleveland. And this project was somewhat of a passion project for me. My background is in architecture, and actually got my community-based work started when I was serving as an AmeriCorps member for the Charlotte affiliate of Habitat for Humanity. I was just coming off of architecture graduate program, and kind of working in an architecture firm at the time, but was able to connect with a colleague who's also an architect, Brian Lee, who's working out of New Orleans, who was hosting a multiple number of design as protest design ciphers in multiple cities around the country, and was looking for people to carry some of the load and host them in the cities that they lived in. So at the time, I thought this sounded like a really interesting event to get involved with. And essentially what it was, I think it happened in over 10 cities, but we organized a day of action that was held on January 20th in 2017. And if you can remember back, that was the inauguration day for President Trump. So everyone's emotions were kind of all over the place, but the intent of the event was to bring people together to share their thoughts and concerns about what the administration meant to us specifically, and then also, of course, because our backgrounds were in architecture, what that meant for the built environment and how it related to social justice on both the local and the national level. So essentially it was an event to spark dialogue and see if we could put some action behind all the kind of thoughts that were going on through our heads. So the event was just a 2.5-hour event. It was a smaller ioby campaign, and basically I think we just fundraised for a lot of supplies and food, and then we got the space donated. But the questions that we asked the participants were what concerns you had about the administration coming in, how does it affect you directly or indirectly, and then we posted all those concerns on Post-it notes. So as you can see in the picture, we had a wall full of concerns, and then we worked to kind of group them together and then come up with tangible action steps beyond there. So initially it was an ioby campaign for one event, and then it kind of turned into another event, but really it was really helpful to connect different people across Cleveland together. So there were activists and architects and designers and planners and a couple lawyers there, and then also some student engagement and involvement. So it worked out really well, and ioby was a great help in putting the package together to get folks to come out.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Michelle, and Aileen and Alice as well. So we will be hearing more from our panelists very shortly, and we'll open it up to some questions that are specifically about storytelling, but just by means of a little bit of framing in the way that ioby thinks about storytelling, in the way that many of our project leaders who are trying to fundraise think about storytelling. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about some of the best practices that we have learned from working, over the years with almost 2,000 project leaders. So I think the main thing to know is that storytelling is organizing, right? It is something to get comfortable with. If you're going to be fundraising, if you're going to be doing any sort of organizing, you will tell your story over and over and over again. So you might as well get in there, get comfortable. And you'll be telling it in person, you'll be telling it over email and social media. It helps to practice, write it down in different forms. If you're fundraising with other people, which we always recommend that you do, that you have a team of, a fundraising team of at least 3 people. Every member of your fundraising team will tell the story a little bit differently because it's going to be rooted in their own personal experience, right? And fundamentally, you're talking about why you care about this project and why the person that you're talking to should care. And it should center on, the need for and the impact that your project is making. And that's basically the most important part. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think we have like 5 best practices that I'll quickly go through that we've learned from folks that have done this really well. And I wanted to give examples also just to make it a little bit less abstract. These are real ioby leaders who, and like real parts of the stories that they've told to just kind of illustrate each point. So the most important thing really is that your story is personal, right? People give because of the person who is asking. They give because they care about you, and they give because they care about your story. So talk about why you care. Talk about why this is important to you and why you're spending basically your free time on it, right? You must be passionate about it if you're spending your time on it and if you're asking people to contribute. So this was an ioby leader who created a pollinator garden in New Jersey, and she was affiliated with a school there. And she says, our kids live in an urban environment, and that's the kind of environment I grew up in. There was no one really teaching us about nature. We didn't have those opportunities. So now that I enjoy gardening and I see what a pleasure it is and how much of a difference we can make in our environment, I want to share that with our students. So, right, rooted in personal experience and rooted in her passion for sharing that experience with her students. Secondly, I think it's important to, keep your story really focused. This can be challenging because your project might be addressing a major social issue that is like, rampant and historically based in your city, in the country, in the world. But what is the exact sort of tactical change that you're trying to make? What are you trying to solve? It might be a much smaller part of that. And keeping it really tactical, keeping it really tangible, that like, here is the smaller problem and here is like our exact way of solving it, I think is really important in just keeping your story rooted to reality. So this was a leader in Cleveland who was working to provide legal support for people of color who were coming up against the criminal justice system. So people have warrants out for their arrest because they've missed a court hearing. So we make sure people get support, make sure they know they have a court appearance, make sure that they know what their options are, and make sure they have a lawyer. So rather than talking kind of more vaguely about the larger problem of the criminal justice system, she really keeps it rooted in like, the individual client experience, making sure that they know they have a court appearance. That's like a pretty small and solvable problem within a much larger issue. So she helps to keep it rooted and keep it focused. The third one is, this might seem directly contradictory to what I just said, but at the same time as you're keeping it really tactical, you want to keep it in the context of like the larger narrative. What sort of positivity is your project representing in kind of the face of a larger narrative that's going on? So this was a leader who was working with youth in East New York, Brooklyn, on a vacant lot conversion. And he had really positive things to say about the neighborhood in general. So it's a neighborhood that you can hold up as an example of the power that people can have over their own surroundings and the difference that residents can make in their own communities. East New York is a shining example of a community that has taken back its own space. And you can see that within that, like kids converting a vacant lot into something usable and something positive for the neighborhood is kind of like a, you know, a micro version of that larger story of East New York taking back its own space. And so he did a really good job of sort of rooting this smaller narrative within a larger positive narrative about the neighborhood that he has experience in. The fourth one is about authority, and I don't mean this as, you know, you need to be a scientist, you need to be, you know, in a position of power. I think, you know, lived experience can be just as valuable, if not more valuable, as an authority. But this was a leader who actually did use like some numbers in her story, and she did it to a really positive effect. So she was planting trees in Kentucky, and she had some data about the trees that are part of her story. So each time they plant a tree, we're improving the overall canopy. We're fighting the urban heat island effect. We're managing stormwater. We're improving air quality, saving energy, reducing emissions. We're doing all those ecosystem services that a good, healthy, robust canopy will provide. Each tree provides more than $16,000 worth of environmental benefits. That's a really impressive number. You know, she has a list of the tangible benefits that she knows through doing this work that the trees will provide. And she's able to speak authoritatively about like a dollar value. That's really convincing. All of that to say, though, that, you know, you don't have to include things like dollar values if you, you know, if your authority comes from your lived experience of a challenge and your lived experience of a solution, that can be just as valuable. But position yourself as someone who knows what you're talking about, and that will really help to kind of, you know, drive your story home. And the last one is just, you know, you want your project to be high stakes, right? You're you might be addressing a large, important issue in your neighborhood. You might have been working on this, you know, for many, many years, and you just want to make sure that your audience understands that, like, without your project, something bad will happen, and your project is helping to make something positive happen. And you know, you can make it a little bit of a dramatic moment. So this was a leader who, in New Orleans, who had a project to deliver books to young kids. And she said, New Orleans kids want books about African-American history, of course. They want books about themselves. Books that represent them in positive lights are few and far between. These young people's knowledge of self is being eradicated on a daily basis by racism, brutality, poverty, and it's really hard, right? So it's not just about books. It's about delivering, you know, positive stories for kids to be able to see themselves. That is a pretty dramatic thing to be solving, right? It's a pretty high stakes problem that this project is addressing. So this was a leader who did a good job of sort of showing the stakes in a very clear way. And yeah, so those are kind of 5 of the lessons that we most often see in project leaders who we think are really successful at telling their stories and in their fundraising. And with that framing, we're going to open it back up to our panelists to hear a little bit about the role of storytelling in their own fundraising and in their own organizing and in their own building support for their projects. So I think, you know, we can go in any order here, but I think I'll just, in order to direct the question somewhere, maybe we'll have Alice lead us here. And Alice, maybe before we specifically talk about storytelling in general, I'd like to hear from you and from everyone why you decided to use crowdfunding to raise the money for your project.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, our time bank is turning 10 years old this year. And so we sort of approximately the first half of our existence, we're an all volunteer, low to no budget kind of organization. And then about 5 years ago, we got a grant to be able to hire on some staff and buy some tools and other supplies. which was great, but grants eventually end. And sometimes ideas like time banking that don't fit into the neat box of a lot of grants are hard to find that kind of funding for. So we realized that we needed to do some fundraising, and so using a crowdfunding platform like ioby was really great because most of us in the leadership team were new to fundraising, and so it was nice to have the resources of ioby and sort of the framework that they offered. And also for us, we're a membership organization. We're, you know, from the grassroots, we're about, you know, celebrating the wealth of our community in terms of skills and time. So doing that, you know, on the funding money side of things made a lot of sense as well.
And how about Michelle or Aileen, whoever would like to talk about sort of the decision to go a crowdfunding route for your project?
I can go. It initially seemed like one of those easy wins for me because the dollar amount that I was raising was pretty small comparatively to some of the other campaigns that I've seen. But I think for me, the biggest part of it was the buy-in that I could get, where it was being presented on a national platform, but, you know, any amount of money would help, like $5 to $10. So in my call, I also asked that, like, if you planned on attending the event, that you contributed in some way. And it was just really nice to see us kind of get a bunch of small amounts to make it up to the total amount.
So I would add that the reason why we really were curious about a crowdfunding approach, we had, keep in mind, this was back in 2014, and we're a business organization at heart. We advocate for a vital and vibrant vibrant, economically strong downtown Denver. And so we were really intrigued by Kickstarter, and Kickstarter was kind of a new thing, and we kind of liked how people got to vote with their dollars for these really cool, innovative ideas. And so we wanted to apply that approach to kind of a public asset, a good in our downtown that would help people get around downtown faster and easier and safer. And would be appealing to a new generation of employees that were starting to populate downtown. So we also thought of the crowdfunding approach as a way for people to literally vote with their dollars. And even though we had a huge amount of money that we are fundraising for, we too also gathered a lot of really small donations. We think our smallest donation investment in the program was $2. And then we certainly had businesses that donated more like $1,000. So, but I was just actually looking at our donations, and we had a pretty low average donation. We had over 200 donors. And when you think about how much money we had to raise, I was still really impressed with the number of low dollar donations. And in fact, our city was really impressed with that as well. And it made a statement to our city and to our elected officials that all types of people from different walks of life, from neighbors to businesses to employees to just citizens in our city who wanted a safer way to get around downtown, were investing in this. And it's, you know, in public works projects, you don't really get to vote on what the city gets to do. And sometimes it's really hard to convince a public works department to try something innovative and different. And keep in mind that even though most transportation departments these days are very impressed with protected bike lanes, and if they can, it's definitely their first choice. In 2014, it was still a relatively new idea, and it was, our whole public works department had to just restructure itself because they were organized in such a way that it made it really difficult to install a protected bike lane. It was much more difficult than painting a stripe of paint on the street. So the 200 different donors that we had and we were able to use through the crowdfunding process demonstrated to our Department of Public Works and our elected officials that this was something our community was really interested in.
Thank you so much. I'm curious to hear now from you specifically about the role of storytelling in your fundraising. And I think Maybe we'll start with Michelle. Michelle, like one of the things that I think is so interesting about your project is just that it happened at this moment in time where you were in this larger narrative of, you know, a change in presidential administration, which felt like it gave people a sense of urgency, right? So I'm curious to hear about the role of storytelling in your fundraising, I think with particularly like in regards to like that historical moment that you were in.
Yeah, and I think I really didn't have to say much. I think everyone kind of felt what they were feeling, and it was just charged on both sides of the spectrum. So I think the fact of, you know, wanting to do something on that day, which meant so much to a lot of people in terms of, you know, like justice across the board, whether it's economic or racial or environmental. I think there were people who were, you know, either deeply concerned about what was about to happen or deeply supportive. And there was a narrative of how we were feeling about each other as well. So for me, I think, number one, having it on that day kind of indirectly created the story. And then also it was bringing awareness to, you know, in the back of my mind, I was trying to bring awareness to how could architects and designers be more ingrained in this conversation that we're having, and how can we look at space differently where I think racially there's a lot of communities that probably had no hope. So this was a way to kind of instill different measures of how we could be hopeful and how we could address some of the thoughts and feelings that we were having.
Thanks. Either Alex or Aileen, would you like to say a few words about storytelling?
I can add, I think that in a bike lane, and we were just asking for many, for even just the design of a bike lane, I think it was really important to tell a story of the people that were going to be using it. So we talked a lot about the different types of people that would be using it. I also think that's an important asset when you're talking about any sort of infrastructure, and bike lanes in particular, where we often characterize the users as bicyclists and we label them that way. And I know something that we've worked really hard on in Denver is when we talk about transportation infrastructure, even when we reference drivers, we prefer to say things that people who are driving cars and people who are riding bikes. And then that we can humanize the situation a little bit more. And I think that's a lot easier to tell the story when you're talking about actual people, and we're talking about students, and we're talking about moms and dads who are riding their kids to work. I think you saw the picture of the man riding his kid to work. We see that all the time now in downtown. And it's not just spandex-clad bicyclists or hipster bicyclists who are delivering pizza or anything. These are real people who are trying to empower their lives by going to school or just making money for their family, using a healthy way to get around town. And just that, I think anytime you can make your story about people, even though it might be an infrastructure, an asset that you're trying to bring to your community, is really important.
Yeah, I mean, so for the time bank, really, we think of like all of our exchanges as little stories that fit into a bigger whole. So really for us, if anything, the struggle is sort of emphasizing that like the whole is smaller than you know, just the pieces, because some of the exchanges are really small things like, you know, Mary got her porch painted, or, you know, each little piece is very small. So putting it into a larger whole around how we're building community and building this community of mutual aid is really important, and something that we're getting better at. And I think also another thing that was really helpful to us is sort of unrelated to the fundraising thing, but what came in handy was we had a member who, one of the services that she offered is that she's a videographer, and was able to make a really nice video for us about the time bank a few months before we decided to do a crowdfunding campaign. And because it's not a physical project, sort of like doing bike lanes and, you know, coming up with photos or something like that for social media was really difficult for us. A lot of the time bank services don't necessarily photograph well. So having people telling their stories in the video was really useful. And also, sort of to go back to what was said earlier about different people telling the story differently in the fundraising. We also, when we were sort of training or asking members to help us with the fundraising, we sort of gave a variety of different like starter pitches to people in order to, like, you know, depending on who you're talking to, different people have different things that they care about. So, you know, our work with seniors might really appeal to, you know, your uncle, but your next door neighbor might be more interested in, you know, the way we're changing the way people think about time and value or something like that.
Thank you. That actually leads really well into a couple of questions that we just got from participants. So I mentioned before in my little section about like, you're going to tell the story in many different ways. And we have a couple of questions that just about like the methods of telling stories. So one question is, what communications were most effective for your campaign between like social media, email, letters, videos, PR, things like that. And then related to that, another question about sort of how you got started. Did you develop an elevator pitch? Was it a PowerPoint? Were you in person, going door to door, telling your story to the community? So I think those are both sort of different ways of asking the same question about like what form your story actually took and what you found to be the most effective.
I'll get going on that. I think that's such a great question, and it really highlights something that I learned in my ioby training, in that the individual pitch is always the best and most effective approach. But I think it is important to layer those pitches in any sort of fundraising task, but certainly the crowdfunding approach. It's easy to forget that the individual ask is going to work the best. And so you have these social media layers. You might have some sort of, you know, I don't know, advertising. And I say that in a very loose sense, whatever kind of media, there might be ways to advertise what your ask is. But nothing works better than an individual ask, but having your story out there and the request for funds in different ways helps to support and helps get people thinking about it, so that when you do find them eventually and say, hey, I think that you would be a perfect donor for this for XYZ reasons, and you would be really impacted in a positive way, and it aligns really well with your values and your goals as an organization or you as an individual, then I think, because the ask isn't coming from nowhere, having seen the campaign in social media, through word of mouth, as an announcement at an organization, or through a broad email that you might send, it really helps people get to say yes a lot quicker. So, and that's also where the story is really important and can really get people over the edge and say, okay, I'm going to do this. And then being quick to follow up and sending reminders. And even though they've said yes, maybe to you on the phone or in an email, they still have to go online and make that donation complete.
And I can go next. For me, I think I kind of did the advertising to get people to come to the event at the same time as getting people to potentially donate to the event as well. So it was kind of one ask for both of them. And kind of going back into that buy-in, I was trying to kind of make the connection between the people who are coming, and then also say, well, if you're interested in coming, then you definitely want to also support this financially. And I think that, worked really well for me. And then also the other thing that I wanted to say was, I think, I asked something specifically of everyone where there was kind of an online toolkit that had like a pre-survey, like if you planned on coming, it gave a few details about what you could expect from the event. So I think in hindsight, I didn't plan it that way, but it helped that people already came ready with ideas already that they had been thinking about previously.
I guess I would just second a lot of what was said as far as like creating buzz using social media and things like that. But then the actual direct ask being really good. We also had a couple of like fundraising events, which is sort of a nice way to do the direct ask, but to more than one person at once. So we have a little neighborhood bar in our area that we have several events a year at. And so we had one fundraising event there where we were able to talk to a bunch of people at once, and also had a couple of house parties. So that's a really nice way to do that direct ask. And then part of the ask is like, not only will you donate while you're here, but like, will you go home and share this with, you know, 2 other friends or something like that, to try and like get the crowd and crowdfunding. And so that was really, really helpful. And yeah, and I think just hearing it from people's mouths is part of what makes that really, really great. Like not only tailoring the story to who you're asking, but people like that human connection. So yeah, I think that, and like I mentioned earlier, the video, like hearing it from people why this thing is really important, is really helpful.
Thank you. We have another question, which I really love, from a participant, which is about whether you tell your story from a place of sort of a positive vision, or that you're kind of addressing a deficit, right? We talk a lot at ioby about sort of asset-based community development, where you're looking for the assets in your community rather than just looking at your community as a place that is full of problems to solve. And I think the way that like stories are framed within this, you can go either way. And sometimes it can be difficult to just like sheerly come from a place of solving problems and like identifying deficits in your community. I'm curious if any of you have thoughts about like storytelling from a place of assets versus like a place of deficits, or just if you want to think about like telling a positive story versus telling a negative story. If any of you have thoughts on that.
So we got a lot of negative questions about the bike lane. We got a lot of feedback that, you know, shouldn't the city be paying for this? Why do local citizens have to be paying for it? It's something that's, you know, we pay for in our taxes. And we got a lot of feedback of like, why should I even bother donating to this? It's something the city should be doing anyway. And so it's really, this is where storytelling just comes back, and it really helps you. The message was positive, and we stuck to it, and we said, well, first of all, we didn't lessen the concerns. We didn't dismiss them at all. They were very legitimate concerns. Yes, of course the city should be paying for this in a perfect world, but we live in a world with, you know, we don't have enough money with diminished resources. We don't have enough money for everything that we'd love to do. But this is a great way. This is the message that we led with when pressed with those questions and concerns was, but this is a great way to stand up, and you don't have to donate that much money to tell the city that this is how you want them to spend their dollars in the future. And we were very responsive to that expressed concern, in that we said that we don't intend this to be a long-term funding mechanism for the bike lane. And I guess that example is very specific to our project. But I suppose that other similar crowdfunding projects could have that concern with them as well. But I think we got over that negativity with just reframing the case and said, hey, we're not asking you we're not going to come back and ask you to do this every year. This is purely a one-time thing to demonstrate to our city that this type of investment and spending this type of money is really important. So I think my overarching message would be trust yourself and trust your message and stick to it. And if you want to keep it positive, you find a way to frame that message and frame the discussion in a positive light. I think sometimes we lose a little confidence that we have that ability. You definitely should expect it. And if you want to stay positive, you have every ability to do it.
Yeah, I can go next just briefly. I mean, the time bank is really all about concentrating on the assets that we already have. A big part of our message is that, you know, here in Detroit, I think a lot of us know about the problems that our city has had and continues to have. But that rather than concentrating on our deficits in the way that like we need a lot of things, concentrating on the assets that we already have and how we can best, you know, put those to work and enhance those. And I think, again, it also kind of depends on your audience, you know, so like, again, like here, where like we already sort of know a lot of the, you know, that we have really high poverty rates, that we have, you know, a lack of social services in a lot of places in the city and things like that. So we don't necessarily have to explain that if I'm, you know, trying to, if I'm talking to somebody who lives outside of the region or who might not be familiar with our neighborhood, which has like a specific, specific assets and also specific problems, then I might, you know, go into a little bit about what those problems are. But I think keeping it positive is really good because what you're fundraising for is the solution. And so you really want to concentrate on what the end goal is, I think, rather than concentrating on the problem that you're trying to solve or like the deficits that you have. But yeah, but also being realistic. I mean, I think that's the other thing is, you know, not trying, you know, like when I did pitches at like the fundraising events, like we mostly talked about what we were fundraising for and trying to keep it positive, but we were also very honest about like, hey, like part of why we are doing this fundraiser, part of why we're asking you for money is that, you know, like this really creative and innovative thing, like we haven't been able to get traditional foundation funding for it for these reasons, and so that's why we really need you to support this idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think a lot of the fundraising campaigns that come out through ioby are really like emotional and really heavy. So it's really important just to be kind of empathetic to receiving whatever kind of response you get. And, you know, just being calm and having an answer. And I think at the end of the day, everyone wants to be happy. So there's always a silver lining and an opportunity that you can find in negative feedback.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more participant question. And I have a question here about, I mentioned something before about like different members of your fundraising team will tell your story differently. So someone asked a question about, you know, working with a nonprofit that has a real concern about like the core story being changed. Some of the nuance will be lost sort of depending on who's telling the story. So they want to know like, if you have thoughts about like how to let some of that go, but ensure that like the core story is being told no matter who is doing the telling. I wonder if any of you have experience with multiple people telling the same story and how to make sure that it's being told in a way that gets the core part across while still being, you know, personal to each person telling the story. Has anyone worked in that world?
I've worked not even quite as much with this specific project, but I've worked in that world a little bit. And I think part of it is, you know, when you are sort of training your leadership team or, you know, I think calling it training might turn off some people, but when you're like bringing that team together, kind of practicing the base pitch together a little bit can be really good as far as, you know, like making sure that people feel comfortable telling the core story, but also making sure that you're getting the facts right. But I also think that you have to especially if you're doing the sort of grassroots project that I think most people tend to use crowdfunding for. Like, everyone's perspective is going to be a little bit different, and you do just have to let that go. I think you can't be, if you're doing this sort of dispersed project, like, you can't be a control freak about it. And like, you know, I think in that way, the time bank is a really good example. Like, you know, for some people, the time banking is about, you know, like undermining capitalism and changing the world. And for some people, it's about getting their lawn mowed during the summer. And both of those are really, like, that's part of why it's great. It's, both of those are really valid ways of looking at the same project. And so you're going to have different people telling the story different for a reason. In that case. But yeah, I mean, certainly you want to be sure that everyone's getting the facts right. So I think practicing in front of each other and framing it in that way is a really good way to be sure that you're doing that.
Yeah, if you turn your team into robots and they're all just repeating the same message that you've created for them, it doesn't come off in their own words, and it's not authentic, and it will inevitably be less effective. So I think you're right in that you absolutely, Alice is right in that you really need to make sure that the facts are clear and you know, developing some basic messaging points for everybody and facts about the project. People always want to root their argument in facts, but you know, your team probably isn't going to know all the facts anyway. So write that down for them, make it easily accessible, remind them when you're checking in with them about the facts and the talking points, but giving them the ability to craft their own message based off of those basic talking points and based off of those facts is just simply going to make the ask more authentic and more effective. So you just have to let it go. And I loved what Alice said about you just don't know what people are going to value. You can guess, you might do some research ahead of time, but you just really don't know what's going to trigger people to make a donation and what their own personal history is. So letting your team test those different messages out is really important. And you might come up with a new way to ask for the money in the middle of your campaign that you had no idea would be so effective.
And I was going to say, I didn't have an experience like this, but the one example that I can think of based off of what you guys just said was that YouTube video about knowing your why. So even though, you know, like the base guidelines are the same, it's definitely going to mean something different to each person. And I think if you can at least collectively know what those different values are, then you can, you know, use the right people in front of the right audiences and be more strategic about who goes to which crowd to ask for funding.
Thank you so much. We're coming up on the end of our hour. So Michelle, Aileen, Alice, thank you once again so much for lending your time to this conversation and for your expertise and your experience and sharing all of that with us. This is a series of webinars that we do once a month. So we hear from different project leaders on different topics once a month. Thanks to all of our participants for spending this hour with us as well. You will all get a follow-up survey. So please fill it out to help us improve our programming. In the meantime, if you have an idea for a project of your own, you can tell us about it at ioby.org/idea, and we will reach out to you and help you think about next steps. You can also sign up for our newsletter to hear about upcoming programs like this one, and you can follow us on social media. Here's all of our handles. So hopefully you will be able to join us for future webinars and be in touch with us. And thanks again to all of our wonderful panelists and for all of you for spending the hour with us. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.